Chapter 13. Marlow Bisham Abbey. The Medmenham monks. Montmorency thinks he will murder an old tomcat but eventually decides that he will let it live. Shameful conduct of a fox terrier at the civil service stores. Our departure from Marlow. An imposing procession. The steam launch. Useful receipts for annoying and hindering it. We decline to drink the river. A peaceful dog. Strange disappearance of Harris and a pie. Marlow is one of the pleasantest river centers I know of. It is a bustling, lively little town, not very picturesque on the whole, it is true, but there are many quaint nooks and corners to be found in it, nevertheless standing arches in the shattered bridge of time, over which our fancy travels back to the days when Marlow Manor owned Saxon Algar for its lord, ere conquering William seized it to give to Queen Matilda, ere it passed to the Earls of Warwick or to worldly wise Lord Paget, the counsellor of 4 successive sovereigns. There is lovely country round about it, too, if, after boating, you are fond of a walk, while the river itself is at its best here. Down to Cooksum, past the quarry woods and the meadows, is a lovely reach. Dear old quarry woods, with your narrow, climbing paths, and little winding glades, how scented to this hour you seem with memories of sunny summer days. How haunted are your shadowy vistas with the ghosts of laughing faces. How from your whispering leaves there softly fall the voices of long ago. Bisham Abbey. From Marlow up to Sonning is even fairer yet. Grand old Bisham Abbey, whose stone walls have rung to the shouts of the Knights Templars, and which, at one time, was the home of Anne of Clovis and at another of Queen Elizabeth, is passed on the right bank just half a mile above Marlow Bridge. Bisham Abbey is rich in melodramatic properties. It contains a tapestry bedchamber, and a secret room hid high up in the thick walls. The ghost of the Lady Holy, who beat her little boy to death, still walks there at night, trying to wash its ghostly hands clean in a ghostly basin. Warwick, the kingmaker, rests there, careless now about such trivial things as earthly kings and earthly kingdoms, and Salisbury, who did good service at Poitiers. Just before you come to the abbey, and right on the river's bank, is Bisham Church, and, perhaps, if any tombs are worth inspecting, they are the tombs and monuments in Bisham Church. It was while floating in his boat under the Bisham beaches that Shelley, who was then living at Marlow, you can see his house now, in West Street, composed The Revolt of Islam, by Hurley Weir. A little higher up, I have often thought that I could stay a month without having sufficient time to drink in all the beauty of the scene. The village of Hurley, 5 minutes' walk from the loch, is as old a little spot as there is on the river, dating, as it does, to quote the quaint phraseology of those dim days, from the times of King Sebert and King Offa. Just past the weir going up is Danes Field, where the invading Danes once encamped, during their march to Gloucestershire, and a little further still, nestling by a sweet corner of the stream, is what is left of Medmenham Abbey. The famous Medmenham monks, or Hellfire Club, as they were commonly called, and of whom the notorious Wilkes was a member, were a fraternity whose motto was "Do as you please," and that invitation still stands over the ruined doorway of the abbey. Many years before this bogus abbey, with its congregation of irreverent jesters, was founded, there stood upon this same spot a monastery of a sterner kind, whose monks were of a somewhat different type to the revelers that were to follow them, 500 years afterwards. The Cistercian monks, whose abbey stood there in the 13th century, wore no clothes but rough tunics and cowls, and ate no flesh, nor fish, nor eggs. They lay upon straw, and they rose at midnight to mass. They spent the day in labor, reading, and prayer, and over all their lives there fell a silence as of death, for no one spoke. A grim fraternity, passing grim lives in that sweet spot, that God had made so bright. Strange that nature's voices all around them, the soft singing of the waters, the whisperings of the river grass, the music of the rushing wind, should not have taught them a truer meaning of life than this. They listened there, through the long days, in silence, waiting for a voice from heaven, and all day long and through the solemn night it spoke to them in myriad tones, and they heard it not. From Medmenham to Sweet Hambledon Loch the river is full of peaceful beauty, but, after it passes Greenlands, the rather uninteresting looking river residence of my newsagent, a quiet unassuming old gentleman, who may often be met with about these regions, during the summer months, sculling himself along in easy vigorous style, or chatting genially to some old lock keeper, as he passes through until well the other side of Henley. It is somewhat bare and dull. We got up tolerably early on the Monday morning at Marlow, and went for a bathe before breakfast, and, coming back, Montmorency made an awful ass of himself. The only subject on which Montmorency and I have any serious difference of opinion is cats. I like cats, Montmorency does not. Cat, when I meet a cat, I say, poor pussy. and stop down and tickle the side of its head, and the cat sticks up its tail in a rigid, cast iron manner, arches its back, and wipes its nose up against my trousers, and all is gentleness and peace. When Montmorency meets a cat, the whole street knows about it, and there is enough bad language wasted in 10 seconds to last an ordinarily respectable man all his life, with care. I do not blame the dog, contenting myself, as a rule, with merely clouting his head or throwing stones at him, because I take it that it is his nature. Fox Terriers are born with about 4 times as much original sin in them as other dogs are, and it will take years and years of patient effort on the part of us Christians to bring about any appreciable reformation in the rowdiness of the Fox Terrier nature. I remember being in the lobby of the Haymarket stores one day, and all round about me were dogs, waiting for the return of their owners, who were shopping inside. There were a Mastiff, and 1 or 2 Collies, and a Saint Bernard, a few Retrievers and Newfoundlands, a Boarhound, a French Poodle, with plenty of hair round its head, but mangy about the middle, a Bulldog, a few Lowther arcade sort of animals, about the size of rats, and a couple of Yorkshire Tykes. There they sat, patient, good, and thoughtful. A solemn peacefulness seemed to reign in that lobby. An air of calmness and resignation, of gentle sadness, pervaded the room. Then a sweet young lady entered, leading a meek-looking little Fox Terrier, and left him, chained up there, between the Bulldog and the Poodle. He sat and looked about him for a minute. Then he cast up his eyes to the ceiling, and seemed, judging from his expression, to be thinking of his mother. Then he yawned. Then he looked round at the other dogs, all silent, grave, and dignified. He looked at the Bulldog, sleeping dreamlessly on his right. He looked at the Poodle, erect and haughty, on his left. Then, without a word of warning, without the shadow of a provocation, he bit that Poodle's near foreleg, and a yelp of agony rang through the quiet shades of that lobby. The result of his first experiment seemed highly satisfactory to him, and he determined to go on and make things lively all round. He sprang over the Poodle and vigorously attacked a Collie, and the Collie woke up, and immediately commenced a fierce and noisy contest with the Poodle. Then Foxy came back to his own place, and caught the Bulldog by the ear, and tried to throw him away, and the Bulldog, a curiously impartial animal, went for everything he could reach, including the hall porter, which gave that dear little terrier the opportunity to enjoy an uninterrupted fight of his own with an equally willing Yorkshire Tyke. Anyone who knows canine nature need hardly be told that, by this time, all the other dogs in the place were fighting as if their hearts and homes depended on the fray. The big dogs fought each other indiscriminately, and the little dogs fought among themselves, and filled up their spare time by biting the legs of the big dogs. The whole lobby was a perfect pandemonium, and the din was terrific. A crowd assembled outside in the Haymarket, and asked if it was a vestry meeting, or, if not, who was being murdered, and why men came with poles and ropes, and tried to separate the dogs, and the police were sent for. And in the midst of the riot that sweet young lady returned, and snatched up that sweet little dog of hers he had laid the Tyke up for a month, and had on the expression, now, of a newborn lamb into her arms, and kissed him, and asked him if he was killed, and what those great nasty brutes of dogs had been doing to him, and he nestled up against her, and gazed up into her face with a look that seemed to say, "Oh, I'm so glad you've come to take me away from this disgraceful scene." She said that the people at the stores had no right to allow great savage things like those other dogs to be put with respectable people's dogs, and that she had a great mind to summon somebody. Such is the nature of Fox Terriers, and, therefore, I do not blame Montmorency for his tendency to row with cats, but he wished he had not given way to it that morning. We were, as I have said, returning from a dip, and halfway up the high street a cat darted out from one of the houses in front of us, and began to trot across the road. Montmorency gave a cry of joy, the cry of a stern warrior who sees his enemy given over to his hands, the sort of cry Cromwell might have uttered when the Scots came down the hill and flew after his prey. His victim was a large black tom. I never saw a larger cat, nor a more disreputable looking cat. It had lost half its tail, one of its ears, and a fairly appreciable proportion of its nose. It was a long, sinewy-looking animal. It had a calm, contented air about it. Montmorency went for that poor cat at the rate of 20 miles an hour, but the cat did not hurry up, did not seem to have grasped the idea that its life was in danger. It trotted quietly on until its would-be assassin was within a yard of it, and then it turned round and sat down in the middle of the road, and looked at Montmorency with a gentle, inquiring expression, that said, "Yes." You want me? Montmorency does not lack pluck, but there was something about the look of that cat that might have chilled the heart of the boldest dog. He stopped abruptly, and looked back at Tom. Neither spoke, but the conversation that one could imagine was clearly as follows. The cat, can I do anything for you? Montmorency, no, thanks. The cat, don't you mind speaking, if you really want anything, you know. Montmorency backing down the high street, oh, no not at all certainly don't you trouble. I am afraid I've made a mistake. I thought I knew you. Sorry I disturbed you. The cat, not at all quite a pleasure. Sure you don't want anything, now. Montmorency still backing, not at all, thanks not at all very kind of you. Good morning. The cat, good morning. Then the cat rose, and continued his trot, and Montmorency, fitting what he calls his tail carefully into its groove, came back to us, and took up an unimportant position in the rear. To this day, if you say the word cats to Montmorency, he will visibly shrink and look up piteously at you, as if to say, please don't. We did our marketing after breakfast, and revictualled the boat for 3 days. George said we ought to take vegetables, that it was unhealthy not to eat vegetables. He said they were easy enough to cook, and that he would see to that, so we got 10 pounds of potatoes, a bushel of peas, and a few cabbages. We got a beefsteak pie, a couple of gooseberry tarts, and a leg of mutton from the hotel, and fruit, and cakes, and bread and butter, and jam, and bacon and eggs, and other things we foraged round about the town for. Our departure from Marlow I regard as one of our greatest successes. It was dignified and impressive, without being ostentatious. We had insisted at all the shops we had been to that the things should be sent with us then and there. None of your yes, sir, I will send them off at once, the boy will be down there before you are, sir. And then fooling about on the landing stage, and going back to the shop twice to have a row about them, for us. We waited while the basket was packed, and took the boy with us. We went to a good many shops, adopting this principle at each one, and the consequence was that, by the time we had finished, we had as fine a collection of boys with baskets following us around as heart could desire, and our final march down the middle of the high street, to the river, must have been as imposing a spectacle as Marlow had seen for many a long day. The order of the procession was as follows. Montmorency, carrying a stick. 2 disreputable-looking curs, friends of Montmorency's. George, carrying coats and rugs, and smoking a short pipe. Harris, trying to walk with easy grace, while carrying a bulged-out Gladstone bag in one hand, and a bottle of lime juice in the other. Greengrocer's boy and baker's boy, with baskets. Boots from the hotel, carrying hamper. Confectioner's boy, with basket. Grocer's boy, with basket. Long-haired dog. Cheesemonger's boy, with basket. Odd man carrying a bag. Bosom companion of odd man, with his hands in his pockets, smoking a short clay. Fruiter's boy, with basket. Myself, carrying 3 hats and a pair of boots, and trying to look as if I didn't know it. 6 small boys, and 4 stray dogs. When we got down to the landing stage, the boatman said, let me see, sir, was yours a steam launch or a houseboat? The bring of the provisions on our informing him it was a double-sculling skiff, he seemed surprised. We had a good deal of trouble with steam launches that morning. It was just before the Henley week, and they were going up in large numbers, some by themselves, some towing houseboats. I do hate steam launches, I suppose every rowing man does. I never see a steam launch but I feel I should like to lure it to a lonely part of the river, and there, in the silence and the solitude, strangle it. There is a blatant bumptiousness about a steam launch that has the knack of rousing every evil instinct in my nature, and I yearn for the good old days, when you could go about and tell people what you thought of them with a hatchet and a bow and arrows. The expression on the face of the man who, with his hands in his pockets, stands by the stern, smoking a cigar, is sufficient to excuse a breach of the peace by itself, and the lordly whistle for you to get out of the way would, I am confident, ensure a verdict of justifiable homicide from any jury of river men. They used to have to whistle for us to get out of their way. If I may do so, without appearing boastful, I think I can honestly say that our one small boat, during that week, caused more annoyance and delay and aggravation to the steam launches that we came across than all the other craft on the river put together. Steam launch, coming. One of us would cry out, on sighting the enemy in the distance, and, in an instant, everything was got ready to receive her. I would take the lines, and Harris and George would sit down beside me, all of us with our backs to the launch, and the boat would drift out quietly into midstream. On would come the launch, whistling, and on we would go, drifting. At about 100 yards off, she would start whistling like mad, and the people would come and lean over the side, and roar at us, but we never heard them. Harris would be telling us an anecdote about his mother and George, and I would not have missed a word of it for worlds. Then that launch would give one final shriek of a whistle that would nearly burst the boiler, and she would reverse her engines, and blow off steam, and swing round and get aground. Everyone on board of it would rush to the bow and yell at us, and the people on the bank would stand and shout to us, and all the other passing boats would stop and join in, till the whole river for miles up and down was in a state of frantic commotion. And then Harris would break off in the most interesting part of his narrative, and look up with mild surprise, and say to George, "Why, George, bless me, if here isn't a steam launch." And George would answer, "Well, do you know, I thought I heard something." Upon which we would get nervous and confused, and not know how to get the boat out of the way, and the people in the launch would crowd round and instruct us, "Pull your right you idiot. Back with your left. No, not you, the other one, leave the lines alone, can't you now, both together. Not that way. Oh, you." Then they would lower a boat and come to our assistance, and, after quarter of an hour's effort, would get us clean out of their way, so that they could go on, and we would thank them so much, and ask them to give us a tow. But they never would. Another good way we discovered of irritating the aristocratic type of steam launch, was to mistake them for a bean feast, and ask them if they were Messrs. Cubit's lot or the Bermondsey Good Templars, and could they lend us a saucepan. Old ladies, not accustomed to the river, are always intensely nervous of steam launches. I remember going up once from Staines to Windsor, a stretch of water peculiarly rich in these mechanical monstrosities, with a party containing 3 ladies of this description. It was very exciting. At the first glimpse of every steam launch that came in view, they insisted on landing and sitting down on the bank until it was out of sight again. They said they were very sorry, but that they owed it to their families not to be foolhardy. We found ourselves short of water at Hambledon Lock, so we took our jar and went up to the lockkeeper's house to beg for some. George was our spokesman. He put on a winning smile, and said, "Oh, please could you spare us a little water?" "Certainly," replied the old gentleman, "take as much as you want, and leave the rest." "Thank you so much," murmured George, looking about him. Where do you keep it?" "It's always in the same place, my boy," was the stolid reply, "just behind you." "I don't see it," said George, turning round. "Why, bless us, where's your eyes?" was the man's comment, as he twisted George round and pointed up and down the stream. "There's enough of it to see, ain't there?" "Oh!" exclaimed George, grasping the idea, "but we can't drink the river, you know." "No, but you can drink some of it," replied the old fellow. "It's what I've drunk for the last 15 years. George told him that his appearance, after the course, did not seem a sufficiently good advertisement for the brand, and that he would prefer it out of a pump. We got some from a cottage a little higher up. I dare say that was only river water, if we had known. But we did not know, so it was all right. What the eye does not see, the stomach does not get upset over. We tried river water once, later on in the season, but it was not a success. We were coming downstream, and had pulled up to have tea in a backwater near Windsor. Our jar was empty, and it was a case of going without our tea or taking water from the river. Harris was for chancing it. He said it must be all right if we boiled the water. He said that the various germs of poison present in the water would be killed by the boiling. So we filled our kettle with Thames backwater, and boiled it, and very careful we were to see that it did boil. We had made the tea, and were just settling down comfortably to drink it, when George, with his cup halfway to his lips, paused and exclaimed, "What's that?" "What's what?" asked Harris and I. "Why, that," said George, looking westward. The dog. Harris and I followed his gaze, and saw, coming down towards us on the sluggish current, a dog. It was one of the quietest and peacefullest dogs I have ever seen. I never met a dog who seemed more contented, more easy in its mind. It was floating dreamily on its back, with its 4 legs stuck up straight into the air. It was what I should call a full-bodied dog, with a well-developed chest. On he came, serene, dignified, and calm, until he was abreast of our boat, and there, among the rushes, he eased up, and settled down cozily for the evening. George said he didn't want any tea, and emptied his cup into the water. Harris did not feel thirsty, either, and followed suit. I had drunk half mine, but I wished I had not. I asked George if he thought I was likely to have typhoid. He said, "Oh, no," he thought I had a very good chance indeed of escaping it. Anyhow, I should know in about a fortnight, whether I had or had not. We went up the backwater to Wargrave. It is a short cut, leading out of the right-hand bank about half a mile above Marsh Lock, and is well worth taking, being a pretty, shady little piece of stream, besides saving nearly half a mile of distance. Of course, its entrance is studded with posts and chains, and surrounded with notice boards, menacing all kinds of torture, imprisonment, and death to everyone who dares set skull upon its waters. I wonder some of these riparian boors don't claim the air of the river and threaten everyone with 40 shillings fine who breathes it, but the posts and chains a little skill will easily avoid, and as for the boards, you might, if you have 5 minutes to spare, and there is nobody about, take one or two of them down and throw them into the river. Halfway up the backwater, we got out and lunched, and it was during this lunch that George and I received rather a trying shock. Harris received a shock, too, but I do not think Harris's shock could have been anything like so bad as the shock that George and I had over the business. You see, it was in this way: we were sitting in a meadow, about 10 yards from the water's edge, and we had just settled down comfortably to feed. Harris had the beefsteak pie between his knees, and was carving it, and George and I were waiting with our plates ready. "Have you got a spoon there?" says Harris. "I want a spoon to help the gravy with." The hamper was close behind us, and George and I both turned round to reach one out. We were not 5 seconds getting it. When we looked round again, Harris and the pie were gone. It was a wide, open field. There was not a tree or a bit of hedge for hundreds of yards. He could not have tumbled into the river, because we were on the water side of him, and he would have had to climb over us to do it. George and I gazed all about. Then we gazed at each other. "Has he been snatched up to heaven?" I queried. "They'd hardly have taken the pie too," said George. There seemed weight in this objection, and we discarded the heavenly theory. "I suppose the truth of the matter is," suggested George, descending to the commonplace and practicable, "that there has been an earthquake." And then he added, with a touch of sadness in his voice, "I wish he hadn't been carving that pie." With a sigh, we turned our eyes once more towards the spot where Harris and the pie had last been seen on earth, and there, as our blood froze in our veins and our hair stood up on end, we saw Harris's head, and nothing but his head sticking bolt upright among the tall grass, the face very red, and bearing upon it an expression of great indignation. George was the first to recover. "Speak," he cried, "and tell us whether you are alive or dead, and where is the rest of you?" "Oh, don't be a stupid ass," said Harris's head. "I believe you did it on purpose." "Did what?" exclaimed George and I. "Why, put me to sit here, darn silly trick. Here, catch hold of the pie." Rescuing the pie, and out of the middle of the earth, as it seemed to us, rose the pie very much mixed up and damaged, and, after it, scrambled Harris, tumbled, grubby, and wet. He had been sitting, without knowing it, on the very verge of a small gully, the long grass hiding it from view, and in leaning a little back he had shot over, pie and all. He said he had never felt so surprised in all his life, as when he first felt himself going, without being able to conjecture in the slightest what had happened. He thought at first that the end of the world had come. Harris believes to this day that George and I planned it all beforehand. Thus does unjust suspicion follow even the most blameless, for, as the poet says, who shall escape calumny? Who, indeed? Chapter 14. Wargrave Waxworks Sonning our Stew. Montmorency is sarcastic fight between Montmorency and the tea kettle. George's banjo studies meet with discouragement, difficulties in the way of the musical amateur learning to play the bagpipes. Harris feels sad after supper. George and I go for a walk, return hungry and wet. There is a strangeness about Harris and the swans, a remarkable story. Harris has a troubled night. We caught a breeze, after lunch, which took us gently up past Wargrave and Ship Lake. Mellowed in the drowsy sunlight of a summer's afternoon, Wargrave, nestling where the river bends, makes a sweet old picture as you pass it, and one that lingers long upon the retina of memory. The George and Dragon at Wargrave boasts a sign, painted on the one side by Leslie, R.A., and on the other by Hodgson of that ilk. Leslie has depicted the fight, Hodgson has imagined the scene, after the fight George, the work done, enjoying his pint of beer. Day, the author of Sandford and Merton, lived and more credit to the place still was killed at Wargrave. In the church is a memorial to Mrs. Sarah Hill, who bequeathed £1 annually, to be divided at Easter, between 2 boys and 2 girls who have never been undutiful to their parents, who have never been known to swear or to tell untruths, to steal, or to break windows. Fancy giving up all that for 5 shillings a year. It is not worth it. It is rumored in the town that once, many years ago, a boy appeared who really never had done these things, or at all events, which was all that was required or could be expected, had never been known to do them, and thus won the crown of glory. He was exhibited for 3 weeks afterwards in the town hall, under a glass case. What has become of the money since no one knows. They say it is always handed over to the nearest waxworks show. Shiplake is a pretty village, but it cannot be seen from the river, being upon the hill. Tennyson was married in Shiplake Church. The river up to Sonning winds in and out through many islands, and is very placid, hushed, and lonely. Few folk, except at twilight, a pair or 2 of rustic lovers, walk along its banks. Harry and Lord Fitznoodle have been left behind at Henley, and dismal, dirty reading is not yet reached. It is a part of the river in which to dream of bygone days, and vanished forms and faces, and things that might have been, but are not, confound them. We got out at Sonning, and went for a walk round the village. It is the most fairy-like little nook on the whole river. It is more like a stage village than one built of bricks and mortar. Every house is smothered in roses, and now, in early June, they were bursting forth in clouds of dainty splendor. If you stop at Sonning, put up at the Bull, behind the church, it is a veritable picture of an old country inn, with green, square courtyard in front, where, on seats beneath the trees, the old men group of an evening to drink their ale and gossip over village politics, with low, quaint rooms and latticed windows, and awkward stairs and winding passages. We roamed about sweet Sonning for an hour or so, and then, it being too late to push on past reading, we decided to go back to one of the Shiplake Islands, and put up there for the night. It was still early when we got settled, and George said that, as we had plenty of time, it would be a splendid opportunity to try a good, slap-up supper. He said he would show us what could be done up the river in the way of cooking, and suggested that, with the vegetables and the remains of the cold beef and general odds and ends, we should make an Irish stew. It seemed a fascinating idea. George gathered wood and made a fire, and Harris and I started to peel the potatoes. I should never have thought that peeling potatoes was such an undertaking. The job turned out to be the biggest thing of its kind that I had ever been in. We began cheerfully, one might almost say skittishly, but our light-heartedness was gone by the time the first potato was finished. The more we peeled, the more peel there seemed to be left on. By the time we had got all the peel off and all the eyes out, there was no potato left, at least none worth speaking of. George came and had a look at it. It was about the size of a peanut. He said, "Oh, that won't do. You're wasting them. You must scrape them." So we scraped them, and that was harder work than peeling. They are such an extraordinary shape, potatoes all bumps and warts and hollows. We worked steadily for 25 minutes, and did 4 potatoes. Then we struck. We said we should require the rest of the evening for scraping ourselves. I never saw such a thing as potato scraping for making a fellow in a mess. It seemed difficult to believe that the potato scrapings in which Harris and I stood, half smothered, could have come off 4 potatoes. It shows you what can be done with economy and care. George said it was absurd to have only 4 potatoes in an Irish stew, so we washed half a dozen or so more, and put them in without peeling. We also put in a cabbage and about half a peck of peas. George stirred it all up, and then he said that there seemed to be a lot of room to spare, so we overhauled both the hampers, and picked out all the odds and ends and the remnants, and added them to the stew. There were half a pork pie and a bit of cold boiled bacon left, and we put them in. Then George found half a tin of potted salmon, and he emptied that into the pot. He said that was the advantage of Irish stew, you got rid of such a lot of things. I fished out a couple of eggs that had got cracked, and put those in. George said they would thicken the gravy. I forget the other ingredients, but I know nothing was wasted, and I remember that, towards the end, Montmorency, who had evinced great interest in the proceedings throughout, strolled away with an earnest and thoughtful air, reappearing, a few minutes afterwards, with a dead water rat in his mouth, which he evidently wished to present as his contribution to the dinner, whether in a sarcastic spirit, or with a genuine desire to assist, I cannot say. We had a discussion as to whether the rat should go in or not. Harris said that he thought it would be all right, mixed up with the other things, and that every little helped, but George stood up for precedent. He said he had never heard of water rats in Irish stew, and he would rather be on the safe side, and not try experiments. Harris said, if you never try a new thing, how can you tell what it's like? It's men such as you that hamper the world's progress. Think of the man who first tried German sausage. It was a great success, that Irish stew. I don't think I ever enjoyed a meal more. There was something so fresh and piquant about it. One's palate gets so tired of the old hackneyed things. Here was a dish with a new flavor, with a taste like nothing else on earth. And it was nourishing, too. As George said, there was good stuff in it. The peas and potatoes might have been a bit softer, but we all had good teeth, so that did not matter much, and as for the gravy, it was a poem, a little too rich, perhaps, for a weak stomach, but nutritious. We finished up with tea and cherry tart. Montmorency had a fight with the kettle during tea time, and came off a poor second. Throughout the trip, he had manifested great curiosity concerning the kettle. He would sit and watch it, as it boiled, with a puzzled expression, and would try and rouse it every now and then by growling at it. When it began to splutter and steam, he regarded it as a challenge, and would want to fight it, only, at that precise moment, someone would always dash up and bear off his prey before he could get at it. Today he determined he would be beforehand. At the first sound the kettle made, he rose, growling, and advanced towards it in a threatening attitude. It was only a little kettle, but it was full of pluck, and it up and spit at him. Ah! Would yet, growled Montmorency, showing his teeth, I'll teach ye to cheek a hard-working, respectable dog, ye miserable, long-nosed, dirty-looking scoundrel, ye. Come on. And he rushed at that poor little kettle, and seized it by the spout. Then, across the evening stillness, broke a blood-curdling yelp, and Montmorency left the boat, and did a constitutional 3 times round the island at the rate of 35 miles an hour, stopping every now and then to bury his nose in a bit of cool mud. From that day Montmorency regarded the kettle with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and hate. Whenever he saw it he would growl and back at a rapid rate, with his tail shut down, and the moment it was put upon the stove he would promptly climb out of the boat, and sit on the bank, till the whole tea business was over. George got out his banjo after supper, and wanted to play it, but Harris objected. He said he had got a headache, and did not feel strong enough to stand it. George thought the music might do him good, said music often soothed the nerves and took away a headache, and he twanged 2 or 3 notes, just to show Harris what it was like. Harris said he would rather have the headache. George has never learned to play the banjo to this day. He has had too much all-round discouragement to meet. He tried on 2 or 3 evenings, while we were up the river, to get a little practice, but it was never a success. Harris's language used to be enough to unnerve any man, added to which, Montmorency would sit and howl steadily, right through the performance. It was not giving the man a fair chance. "What's he want to howl like that for when I'm playing?" George would exclaim indignantly, while taking aim at him with a boot. "What do you want to play like that for when he is howling?" Harris would retort, catching the boot. "You let him alone. He can't help howling. He's got a musical ear, and your playing makes him howl." So George determined to postpone study of the banjo until he reached home. But he did not get much opportunity even there. Mrs. P used to come up and say she was very sorry for herself. She liked to hear him, but the lady upstairs was in a very delicate state, and the doctor was afraid it might injure the child. Then George tried taking it out with him late at night, and practicing round the square. But the inhabitants complained to the police about it, and a watch was set for him one night, and he was captured. The evidence against him was very clear, and he was bound over to keep the peace for 6 months. He seemed to lose heart in the business after that. He did make 1 or 2 feeble efforts to take up the work
Hi,
again
my
when the
name is
6
Mari,
months
and my
had
question
elapsed,
is, how do you
but
know
there
if
was
the aim
always the
of
same
the air
coldness, the same
suspension?
want of sympathy on the part of the world to fight against, and,
Hi,
after a
morning,
while,
and
he
thank you,
despaired
Mr.
altogether,
Downey, and to
and
all the
advertised
students
the
of Davis
instrument for
Ferry
sale at a
to the
great
United States.
sacrifice,
If you
owner
would
having no
watch the
further
board,
use for same, and
it's
took to
actually
learning
kind of
card
tough to
tricks
tell if it's
instead.
day or night. First of
It
all,
must be
we get around
disheartening
here
work learning a musical
about
instrument.
15 or 16
You would
times a
think that
day. Every 90
society,
minutes,
for its own
we're
sake,
orbiting the Earth.
would
And
do
so
all
it's
it could
either
to assist
daytime
a
or
man to
nighttime,
acquire
about
the
every
art of
45
playing a
minutes.
musical instrument.
Unfortunately, we don't have a
But
lot
it
of one of
doesn't.
those on the space station, so
I
most
knew
of
a
the time
young
when you're
fellow
working,
once,
you can't
who
really
was
look
studying to
outside
play the
and know that
bagpipes,
it's either
and you
daytime
would
or
be
nighttime.
surprised at the
But
amount
if
of
we could,
opposition he had to
or
contend with.
that was changing every 45
Why,
minutes. So
not
really,
even
we
from
just
the
basically
members
have a
of his
lifeless
own
static all
family
day
did
long.
he receive
So
what you
we
could call
operate on
active
what's called
encouragement.
GMT, or
His
Greenwich Mean
father
Time,
was dead against the
and we
business
basically
from the
turn on the
beginning,
lights around
and
7
spoke
a.m.
quite
in the morning, and
unfeelingly
we
on
turn
the
them off
subject.
around
My
10
friend
p.m.
used
and
to
that
get
way
up
it just
early
keeps
in
the
the
sun
morning
going.
to practice,
And we
but
work
he had to
from
give that
about
plan up,
7
because of his
a.m. to about
sister.
7 p.m. and they get
She
some
was
time off in
somewhat
the evening.
religiously
We
inclined,
also get during
and
the day
she
we get
said
some
it
time to
seemed
work at
such
night
an
with the
awful
wheels
thing to
together.
begin the day
So yeah,
like
mostly
that.
we tell by the lights and
So
just by
he
what
sat
time
up
of day
at
it
night
is.
instead, and played after the family had gone to bed, but that did
Hi, my
not
name
do,
is Alyssa, and
as
my
it got the
question is,
house
how
such a
many
bad name.
exercises have all your body?
People, going home late, would stop outside to listen, and then put it about
Hi,
all over the
Alyssa.
town, the
So
next
I just
morning,
got up here a
that
little
a
over a
fearful
week
murder had
ago,
been
and the
committed at
first thing I
Mr.
noticed
Jefferson's
was
the night
how
before,
disorienting it
and would
was.
describe
And
how they had heard the victim's
we have
shrieks
the
and the brutal
sensors in our
oaths and
inner
curses
ears
of
that
the
detect
murderer,
gravity,
followed
telling us
by the
which
prayer for
way is up
mercy,
and which way is
and the last
down.
dying
But here
gurgle
on
of
the
the
space
corpse.
station, you
So they
can
let him practice in the
quickly
daytime,
make
in the back
the
kitchen with
ceiling
all
the
the doors
floor
shut,
and
but his
vice
more
versa. And
successful
so it
passages
was
could
really
generally be heard
confusing to
in the
me at
sitting
first.
room, in spite of
Also,
these
something you may
precautions,
notice when you
and
see
would affect his
astronauts
mother
is they might
almost
look
to
a little
tears.
puffy in the face.
She said it put her in
No,
mind
I'm
of
just
her poor
kidding.
father. He had been swallowed by a
We
shark,
have fluid
poor
shifts
man,
from,
while
again,
bathing
we're
off the
used to
coast of
being
New
in
Guinea where the
one
connection
thing
came in.
on
She
Earth,
could not
but once we get up
explain.
here, we don't have that
Then
anymore.
they knocked up a
And in
little
terms of
place for
other
him at
effects,
the
we're
bottom of the
studying a lot of
garden,
those. We've
about
seen
quarter
that
of a
we
mile
can
from the
counteract
house,
a lot of
and
them with
made him take the
exercise,
machine
our
down there
ability,
when he
muscle
wanted to work it,
mass and
and
bone
sometimes
density,
a visitor would
where
come
they
to the
were
house who
before we
knew
got
nothing of
Earth.
the matter,
And
and
we're
they would
studying a lot
forget
of
to tell
changes in our
him all
organs
about
and
it,
our eyes from
and
all these
caution
things.
him, and he would go out for a stroll round the garden and suddenly get within
Hi,
earshot
my
of
name is
those
Leah, and my
bagpipes,
question is,
without
what is
being
the most
prepared for
intense
it,
type of
or
training
knowing what
you
it
had to
was.
go through before going into
If he
space?
were a man of strong mind, it only gave him fits, but a
Hey,
person
Lily.
of mere average
Well, we
intellect
go
it
through a
usually
lot of
sent
different
mad.
training when we're up here in
There
space. So
is,
when we first
it
became
must be
astronauts, we trained
confessed,
for about 2 years.
something very
We
sad
learned
about
much
the
about
early efforts
guaranteed,
of an
and that's
amateur
when
in
we learned
bagpipes.
to do
I have
spacewalks in our
felt that
spacesuits.
myself when
We
listening
learned
to
to
my
think
young
ahead so we
friend.
can think a little bit more
They
quickly and
appear
make
to be a
decisions on
trying
the fly,
instrument to perform upon.
like in a very intense
You have to get
environment.
enough breath
We
for the
also
whole
learned how to
tune
write
before you start
language,
at least,
and we learned
so I gathered from watching Jefferson. He would begin magnificently with a wild, full, come to the battle sort of a note, that quite roused you. But he would get more and more piano as he went on, and the last verse generally collapsed in the middle with a splutter and a hiss. You want to be in good health to play the bagpipes. Young Jefferson only learned to play one tune on those bagpipes, but I never heard any complaints about the insufficiency of his repertoire, none whatever. This tune was The Campbells Are Coming, hooray hooray. So he said, though his father always held that it was the Bluebells of Scotland. Nobody seemed quite sure what it was exactly, but they all agreed that it sounded Scotch.
Hi, my name is Annie.
Strangers were allowed 3 guesses, and most of them guessed a different tune each time. Harris was disagreeable after supper. I think it must have been the stew that had upset him. He is not used to high living, so George and I left him in the boat, and settled to go for a mouch round Henley. He said he should have a glass of whiskey and a pipe, and fix things up for the night. We were to shout when we returned, and he would row over from the island and fetch us. Don't go to sleep, old man, we said as we started. Not much fear of that while the stew's on, he grunted, as he pulled back to the island. Henley was getting ready for the regatta, and was full of bustle. We met a goodish number of men we knew about the town, and in their pleasant company the time slipped by somewhat quickly, so that it was nearly 11 o'clock before we set off on our 4-mile walk home, as we had learned to call our little craft by this time. It was a dismal night, coldish, with a thin rain falling, and as we trudged through the dark, silent fields, talking low to each other, and wondering if we were going right or not, we thought of the cozy boat, with the bright light streaming through the tight-drawn canvas, of Harris and Montmorency, and the whiskey, and wished that we were there. We conjured up the picture of ourselves inside, tired and a little hungry, of the gloomy river and the shapeless trees, and, like a giant glowworm underneath them, our dear old boat, so snug and warm and cheerful. We could see ourselves at supper there, pecking away at cold meat, and passing each other chunks of bread. We could hear the cheery clatter of our knives, the laughing voices, filling all the space, and overflowing through the opening out into the night. And we hurried on to realize the vision. We struck the towpath at length, and that made us happy, because prior to this we had not been sure whether we were walking towards the river or away from it, and when you are tired and want to go to bed, uncertainties like that worry you. We passed Skip Lake as the clock was striking the 11:45, and then George said, thoughtfully, "You don't happen to remember which of the islands it was, do you?" "No," I replied, beginning to grow thoughtful too, "I don't." "How many are there?" "Only 4, answered George. "It will be all right, if he's awake." "And if not?" I queried, but we dismissed that train of thought. We shouted when we came opposite the first island, but there was no response, so we went to the second, and tried there, and obtained the same result. "Oh, I remember now," said George, "it was the third one." And we ran on hopefully to the third one, and hallooed. No answer. The case was becoming serious. It was now past midnight. The hotels at Skip Lake and Henley would be crammed, and we could not go round, knocking up cottagers and householders in the middle of the night, to know if they let apartments. George suggested walking back to Henley and assaulting a policeman, and so getting a night's lodging in the station house. But then there was the thought, suppose he only hits us back and refuses to lock us up? We could not pass the whole night fighting policemen. Besides, we did not want to overdo the thing and get 6 months. We despairingly tried what seemed in the darkness to be the fourth island, but met with no better success. The rain was coming down fast now, and evidently meant to last. We were wet to the skin, and cold, and miserable. We began to wonder whether there were only 4 islands or more, or whether we were near the islands at all, or whether we were anywhere within a mile of where we ought to be, or in the wrong part of the river altogether. Everything looked so strange and different in the darkness. We began to understand the sufferings of the babes in the wood. Just when we had given up all hope. Yes, I know that is always the time that things do happen in novels and tales, but I can't help it. I resolved, when I began to write this book, that I would be strictly truthful in all things, and so I will be, even if I have to employ hackneyed phrases for the purpose. It was just when we had given up all hope, and I must therefore say so. Just when we had given up all hope, then, I suddenly caught sight, a little way below us, of a strange, weird sort of glimmer flickering among the trees on the opposite bank. For an instant I thought of ghosts, it was such a shadowy, mysterious light. The next moment it flashed across me that it was our boat, and I sent up such a yell across the water that made the night seem to shake in its bed. We waited breathless for a minute, and then divinest music of the darkness, we heard the answering bark of Montmorency. We shouted back loud enough to wake the 7 sleepers. I never could understand myself why it should take more noise to wake 7 sleepers than one, and, after what seemed an hour, but what was really, I suppose, about 5 minutes, we saw the lighted boat creeping slowly over the blackness, and heard Harris's sleepy voice asking where we were. There was an unaccountable strangeness about Harris. It was something more than mere ordinary tiredness. He pulled the boat against a part of the bank from which it was quite impossible for us to get into it, and immediately went to sleep. It took us an immense amount of screaming and roaring to wake him up again and put some sense into him, but we succeeded at last, and got safely on board. Harris had a sad expression on him, so we noticed, when we got into the boat. He gave you the idea of a man who had been through trouble. We asked him if anything had happened, and he said, swans. It seemed we had moored close to a swan's nest, and, soon after George and I had gone, the female swan came back, and kicked up a row about it. Harris had chivied her off, and she had gone away, and fetched up her old man. Harris said he had had quite a fight with these 2 swans, but courage and skill had prevailed in the end, and he had defeated them. Half an hour afterwards they returned with 18 other swans. It must have been a fearful battle, so far as we could understand Harris's account of it. The swans had tried to drag him and Montmorency out of the boat and drown them, and he had defended himself like a hero for 4 hours, and had killed the lot, and they had all paddled away to die. How many swans did you say there were? Asked George. 32, replied Harris, sleepily. You said 18 just now, said George. No, I didn't, grunted Harris, I said 12. Think I can't count. What were the real facts about these swans? We never found out. We questioned Harris on the subject in the morning, and he said, what swans, and seemed to think that George and I had been dreaming. Oh, how delightful it was to be safe in the boat, after our trials and fears. We ate a hearty supper, George and I, and we should have had some toddy after it, if we could have found the whiskey, but we could not. We examined Harris as to what he had done with it, but he did not seem to know what we meant by whiskey, or what we were talking about at all. Montmorency looked as if he knew something, but said nothing. I slept well that night, and should have slept better if it had not been for Harris. I have a vague recollection of having been woke up at least a dozen times during the night by Harris wandering about the boat with the lantern, looking for his clothes. He seemed to be worrying about his clothes all night. Twice he rooted up George and myself to see if we were lying on his trousers. George got quite wild the second time. What the thunder do you want your trousers for, in the middle of the night? He asked indignantly. Why don't you lie down and go to sleep? I found him in trouble the next time I awoke, because he could not find his socks, and my last hazy remembrance is of being rolled over on my side, and of hearing Harris muttering something about its being an extraordinary thing where his umbrella could have got to. Chapter 15. Household Beauty's love of work. The old river hand, what he does and what he tells you he has done. Skepticism of the new generation. Early boating recollections. Rafting. George does the thing in style. The old boatman, his method so calm, so full of peace. The beginner punting. A sad accident. Pleasures of friendship. Sailing, my first experience. Possible reason why we were not drowned. We woke late the next morning, and, at Harris's earnest desire, partook of a plain breakfast, with non-dainties. Then we cleaned up, and put everything straight. A continual labor, which was beginning to afford me a pretty clear insight into a question that had often posed me, namely, how a woman with the work of only one house on her hands manages to pass away her time, and, at about 10, set out on what we had determined should be a good day's journey. We agreed that we would pull this morning, as a change from towing, and Harris thought the best arrangement would be that George and I should scull, and he steer. I did not chime in with this idea at all. I said I thought Harris would have been showing a more proper spirit if he had suggested that he and George should work, and let me rest a bit. It seemed to me that I was doing more than my fair share of the work on this trip, and I was beginning to feel strongly on the subject. It always does seem to me that I am doing more work than I should do. It is not that I object to the work, mind you, I like work, it fascinates me. I can sit and look at it for hours. I love to keep it by me. The idea of getting rid of it nearly breaks my heart. You cannot give me too much work. To accumulate work has almost become a passion with me. My study is so full of it now, that there is hardly an inch of room for any more. I shall have to throw out a wing soon. And I am careful of my work, too. Why, some of the work that I have by me now has been in my possession for years and years, and there isn't a finger mark on it. I take a great pride in my work. I take it down now and then and dust it. No man keeps his work in a better state of preservation than I do. But, though I crave for work, I still like to be fair. I do not ask for more than my proper share. But I get it without asking for it, at least, so it appears to me, and this worries me. George says he does not think I need trouble myself on the subject. He thinks it is only my overscrupulous nature that makes me fear I am having more than my due, and that, as a matter of fact, I don't have half as much as I ought.
Hi, my name is Gary.
But I expect he only says this to comfort me. In a boat, I have always noticed that it is the fixed idea of each member of the crew that he is doing everything. Harris's notion was, that it was he alone who had been working, and that both George and I had been imposing upon him. George, on the other hand, ridiculed the idea of Harris's having done anything more than eat and sleep, and had a cast iron opinion that it was he, George himself, who had done all the labor worth speaking of. He said he had never been out with such a couple of lazily skulks as Harris and I. That amused Harris. Fancy old George talking about work. He laughed. Why, about half an hour of it would kill him. Have you ever seen George work? He added, turning to me. I agreed with Harris that I never had, most certainly not since we had started on this trip. Well, I don't see how you can know much about it, one way or the other, George retorted on Harris, for I'm blessed if you haven't been asleep half the time. Have you ever seen Harris fully awake, except at mealtime? Asked George, addressing me. Truth compelled me to support George. Harris had been very little good in the boat, so far as helping was concerned, from the beginning. Well, hang it all, I've done more than old Jay anyhow, rejoined Harris. Well, you couldn't very well have done less, added George. I suppose Jay thinks he is the passenger, continued Harris. And that was their gratitude to me for having brought them and their wretched old boat all the way up from Kingston, and for having superintended and managed everything for them, and taken care of them, and slaved for them. It is the way of the world. We settled the present difficulty by arranging that Harris and George should scull up past Reading, and that I should tow the boat on from there. Pulling a heavy boat against a strong stream has few attractions for me now. There was a time, long ago, when I used to clamour for the hard work. Now I like to give the youngsters a chance. I notice that most of the old river hands are similarly retiring, whenever there is any stiff pulling to be done. You can always tell the old river hand by the way in which he stretches himself out upon the cushions at the bottom of the boat, and encourages the rowers by telling them anecdotes about the marvelous feats he performed last season. "Call what you're doing hard work," he drawls, between his contented whiffs, addressing the two perspiring novices, who have been grinding away steadily upstream for the last hour and a half. "Why, Jim Biffles and Jack and I, last season, pulled up from Marlow to Goring in one afternoon, never stopped once. Do you remember that, Jack?" Jack, who has made himself a bed up in the prow of all the rugs and coats he can collect, and who has been lying there asleep for the last 2 hours, partially wakes up on being thus appealed to, and recollects all about the matter, and also remembers that there was an unusually strong stream against them all the way, likewise a stiff wind. "About 34 miles, I suppose, it must have been," adds the first speaker, reaching down another cushion to put under his head. "No, don't exaggerate, Tom," murmurs Jack, reprovingly, 33 at the outside. And Jack and Tom, quite exhausted by this conversational effort, drop off to sleep once more. And the two simple-minded youngsters at the sculls feel quite proud of being allowed to row such wonderful oarsmen as Jack and Tom, and strain away harder than ever. When I was a young man, I used to listen to these tales from my elders, and take them in, and swallow them, and digest every word of them, and then come up for more, but the new generation do not seem to have the simple faith of the old times. We, George, Harris, and myself, took a raw un up with us once last season, and we plied him with the customary stretchers about the wonderful things we had done all the way up. We gave him all the regular ones, the time-honored lies that have done duty up the river with every boating man for years past, and added 7 entirely original ones that we had invented for ourselves, including a really quite likely story, founded, to a certain extent, on an all but true episode, which had actually happened in a modified degree some years ago to friends of ours, a story that a mere child could have believed without injuring itself much. And that young man mocked at them all, and wanted us to repeat the feats then and there, and to bet us 10 to 1 that we didn't. We got to chatting about our rowing experiences this morning, and to recounting stories of our first efforts in the art of oarsmanship. My own earliest boating recollection is of 5 of us contributing 3 pence each and taking out a curiously constructed craft on the Regent's Park Lake, drying ourselves subsequently, in the park keeper's lodge. After that, having acquired a taste for the water, I did a good deal of rafting in various suburban brick fields, an exercise providing more interest and excitement than might be imagined, especially when you are in the middle of the pond and the proprietor of the materials of which the raft is constructed suddenly appears on the bank, with a big stick in his hand. Your first sensation on seeing this gentleman is that, somehow or other, you don't feel equal to company and conversation, and that, if you could do so without appearing rude, you would rather avoid meeting him, and your object is, therefore, to get off on the opposite side of the pond to which he is, and to go home quietly and quickly, pretending not to see him. He, on the contrary, is yearning to take you by the hand, and talk to you. It appears that he knows your father, and is intimately acquainted with yourself, but this does not draw you towards him. He says he'll teach you to take his boards and make a raft of them, but, seeing that you know how to do this pretty well already, the offer, though doubtless kindly meant, seems a superfluous one on his part, and you are reluctant to put him to any trouble by accepting it. His anxiety to meet you, however, is proof against all your coolness, and the energetic manner in which he dodges up and down the pond so as to be on the spot to greet you when you land is really quite flattering. If he be of a stout and short-winded build, you can easily avoid his advances, but, when he is of the youthful and long-legged type, a meeting is inevitable. The interview is, however, extremely brief, most of the conversation being on his part, your remarks being mostly of an exclamatory and monosyllabic order, and as soon as you can tear yourself away you do so. I devoted some 3 months to rafting, and, being then as proficient as there was any need to be at that branch of the art, I determined to go in for rowing proper, and joined one of the Lee boating clubs. Being out in a boat on the River Lee, especially on Saturday afternoons, soon makes you smart at handling a craft, and spry at escaping being run down by roughs or swamped by barges, and it also affords plenty of opportunity for acquiring the most prompt and graceful method of lying down flat at the bottom of the boat so as to avoid being chucked out into the river by passing tow lines. But it does not give you style. It was not till I came to the Thames that I got style. My style of rowing is very much admired now. People say it is so quaint. George never went near the water until he was 16. Then he and 8 other gentlemen of about the same age went down in a body to Kew one Saturday, with the idea of hiring a boat there, and pulling to Richmond and back. One of their number, a shock-headed youth, named Jiskins, who had once or twice taken out a boat on the Serpentine, told them it was jolly fun, boating. The tide was running out pretty rapidly when they reached the landing stage, and there was a stiff breeze blowing across the river, but this did not trouble them at all, and they proceeded to select their boat. There was an 8-oared racing outrigger drawn up on the stage, that was the one that took their fancy. They said they'd have that one, please. The boatman was away, and only his boy was in charge. The boy tried to damp their ardor for the outrigger, and showed them 2 or 3 very comfortable-looking boats of the family party build, but those would not do at all. The outrigger was the boat they thought they would look best in. So the boy launched it, and they took off their coats and prepared to take their seats. The boy suggested that George, who, even in those days, was always the heavy man of any party, should be number 4. George said he should be happy to be number 4, and promptly stepped into bow's place, and sat down with his back to the stern. They got him into his proper position at last, and then the others followed. A particularly nervous boy was appointed cox, and the steering principle explained to him by Jiskins. Jiskins himself took stroke. He told the others that it was simple enough, all they had to do was to follow him. They said they were ready, and the boy on the landing stage took a boat hook and shoved him off. What then followed George is unable to describe in detail. He has a confused recollection of having, immediately on starting, received a violent blow in the small of the back from the butt end of number 5's skull, at the same time that his own seat seemed to disappear from under him by magic, and leave him sitting on the boards. He also noticed, as a curious circumstance, that number 2 was at the same instant lying on his back at the bottom of the boat, with his legs in the air, apparently in a fit. They passed under Kew Bridge, broadside, at the rate of 8 miles an hour. Jiskins being the only one who was rowing. George, on recovering his seat, tried to help him, but, on dipping his oar into the water, it immediately, to his intense surprise, disappeared under the boat, and nearly took him with it. And then Cox threw both rudder lines overboard, and burst into tears. How they got back George never knew, but it took them just 40 minutes. A dense crowd watched the entertainment from Kew Bridge with much interest, and everybody shouted out to them different directions. 3 times they managed to get the boat back through the arch, and 3 times they were carried under it again, and every time Cox looked up and saw the bridge above him he broke out into renewed sobs. George said he little thought that afternoon that he should ever come to really like boating. Harris is more accustomed to sea rowing than to river work, and says that, as an exercise, he prefers it. I don't. I remember taking a small boat out at Eastbourne last summer. I used to do a good deal of sea rowing years ago, and I thought I should be all right, but I found I had forgotten the art entirely. When one scull was deep down underneath the water, the other would be flourishing wildly about in the air. To get a grip of the water with both at the same time I had to stand up. The parade was crowded with nobility and gentry, and I had to pull past them in this ridiculous fashion. I landed halfway down the beach, and secured the services of an old boatman to take me back. I like to watch an old boatman rowing, especially one who has been hired by the hour. There is something so beautifully calm and restful about his method. It is so free from that fretful haste, that vehement striving, that is every day becoming more and more the bane of 19th century life. He is not forever straining himself to pass all the other boats. If another boat overtakes him and passes him it does not annoy him. As a matter of fact, they all do overtake him and pass him, all those that are going his way. This would trouble and irritate some people. The sublime equanimity of the hired boatman under the ordeal affords us a beautiful lesson against ambition and uppishness. Plain practical rowing of the get the boat along order is not a very difficult art to acquire, but it takes a good deal of practice before a man feels comfortable when rowing past girls. It is the time that worries a youngster. "It's jolly funny," he says, as for the 20th time within 5 minutes he disentangles his sculls from yours. "I can get on all right when I'm by myself. To see 2 novices try to keep time with one another is very amusing. Bow finds it impossible to keep pace with Stroke, because Stroke rows in such an extraordinary fashion. Stroke is intensely indignant at this, and explains that what he has been endeavoring to do for the last 10 minutes is to adapt his method to Bow's limited capacity. Bow, in turn, then becomes insulted, and requests Stroke not to trouble his head about him Bow, but to devote his mind to setting a sensible stroke. Or, shall I take Stroke, he adds, with the evident idea that that would at once put the whole matter right. They splash along for another 100 yards with still moderate success, and then the whole secret of their trouble bursts upon Stroke like a flash of inspiration. "I tell you what it is, you've got my sculls," he cries, turning to Bow, "pass yours over." "Well, do you know, I been wondering how it was I couldn't get on with these," answers Bow, quite brightening up, and most willingly assisting in the exchange. "Now we shall be all right." But they are not even then. Stroke has to stretch his arms nearly out of their sockets to reach his sculls now, while Bow's pair, at each recovery, hit him a violent blow in the chest. So they change back again, and come to the conclusion that the man has given them the wrong set altogether, and over their mutual abuse of this man they become quite friendly and sympathetic. George said he had often longed to take to punting for a change. Punting is not as easy as it looks. As in rowing, you soon learn how to get along and handle the craft, but it takes long practice before you can do this with dignity and without getting the water all up your sleeve. One young man I knew had a very sad accident happen to him the first time he went punting. He had been getting on so well that he had grown quite cheeky over the business, and was walking up and down the punt, working his pole with a careless grace that was quite fascinating to watch. Up he would march to the head of the punt, plant his pole, and then run along right to the other end, just like an old punter. Oh, it was grand. And it would all have gone on being grand if he had not unfortunately, while looking round to enjoy the scenery, taken just one step more than there was any necessity for, and walked off the punt altogether. The pole was firmly fixed in the mud, and he was left clinging to it while the punt drifted away. It was an undignified position for him. A rude boy on the bank immediately yelled out to a lagging chum to hurry up and see a real monkey on a stick. I could not go to his assistance, because, as ill luck would have it, we had not taken the proper precaution to bring out a spare pole with us. I could only sit and look at him. His expression as the pole slowly sank with him I shall never forget, there was so much thought in it. I watched him gently let down into the water, and saw him scramble out, sad and wet. I could not help laughing, he looked such a ridiculous figure. I continued to chuckle to myself about it for some time, and then it was suddenly forced in upon me that really I had got very little to laugh at when I came to think of it. Here was I, alone in a punt, without a pole, drifting helplessly down midstream possibly towards a weir. I began to feel very indignant with my friend for having stepped overboard and gone off in that way. He might, at all events, have left me the pole. I drifted on for about a quarter of a mile, and then I came in sight of a fishing punt moored in midstream, in which sat two old fishermen. They saw me bearing down upon them, and they called out to me to keep out of their way. "I can't," I shouted back. "But you don't try," they answered. I explained the matter to them when I got nearer, and they caught me and lent me a pole. The weir was just 50 yards below. I am glad they happened to be there. The first time I went punting was in company with 3 other fellows. They were going to show me how to do it. We could not all start together, so I said I would go down first and get out the punt, and then I could potter about and practice a bit until they came. I could not get a punt out that afternoon, they were all engaged, so I had nothing else to do but to sit down on the bank, watching the river, and waiting for my friends. I had not been sitting there long before my attention became attracted to a man in a punt who, I noticed with some surprise, wore a jacket and cap exactly like mine. He was evidently a novice at punting, and his performance was most interesting. You never knew what was going to happen when he put the pole in. He evidently did not know himself. Sometimes he shot upstream and sometimes he shot downstream, and at other times he simply spun round and came up the other side of the pole. And with every result he seemed equally surprised and annoyed. The people about the river began to get quite absorbed in him after a while, and to make bets with one another as to what would be the outcome of his next push. In the course of time my friends arrived on the opposite bank, and they stopped and watched him too. His back was towards them, and they only saw his jacket and cap. From this they immediately jumped to the conclusion that it was I, their beloved companion, who was making an exhibition of himself, and their delight knew no bounds. They commenced to chaff him unmercifully. I did not grasp their mistake at first, and I thought, how rude of them to go on like that, with a perfect stranger, too. But before I could call out and reprove them, the explanation of the matter occurred to me, and I withdrew behind a tree. Oh, how they enjoyed themselves, ridiculing that young man. For 5 good minutes they stood there, shouting ribaldry at him, deriding him, mocking him, jeering at him. They peppered him with stale jokes, they even made a few new ones and threw at him. They hurled at him all the private family jokes belonging to our set, and which must have been perfectly unintelligible to him. And then, unable to stand their brutal jibes any longer, he turned round on them, and they saw his face. I was glad to notice that they had sufficient decency left in them to look very foolish. They explained to him that they had thought he was someone they knew. They said they hoped he would not deem them capable of so insulting anyone except a personal friend of their own. Of course their having mistaken him for a friend excused it. I remember Harris telling me once of a bathing experience he had at Boulogne. He was swimming about there near the beach, when he felt himself suddenly seized by the neck from behind, and forcibly plunged underwater. He struggled violently, but whoever had got hold of him seemed to be a perfect Hercules in strength, and all his efforts to escape were unavailing. He had given up kicking, and was trying to turn his thoughts upon solemn things, when his captor released him. He regained his feet, and looked round for his would-be murderer. The assassin was standing close by him, laughing heartily, but the